Hi, my name's Aaron Hunter. I'm in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University, and I'm a board member of Irish Screen Studies who's sponsoring this webinar series. This is the final event in this inaugural series, so thank you for attending or for watching. Like most of the other webinars, or like all of the other webinars, I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and hello. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and then hopefully there'll be time for questions. We had a few technical difficulties at the beginning, so I might have to cut a few parts out to make time for questions. I'm going to talk today a little bit about how to prepare and present an academic conference paper. For the first few minutes, I'll talk about why you should go to a conference and maybe how to find out which ones to attend. And then I'll spend a little bit more time talking about how to prepare your paper. If you are a PhD student or an early career researcher, you don't need a how to write an essay 101 sort of thing. So it won't be that. It's more how to think about conference papers as a different kind of writing. And so how to prepare and present and convey your ideas to a live listening audience. After that, I'll say a few things about preparing your slideshow or other video or visual components. And if there's time, which now I think there might not be, I'll talk a little bit about difficult questions and how to deal with them. But maybe if there's a Q&A, we can get to that. A couple more things before I go into my slideshow. This webinar is mainly aimed at researchers in screen and media studies. So when I talk about the major conferences or when I talk about embedding clips, it's geared towards them. But nevertheless, I think that most of what I'll have to say is applicable to conferences across the humanities and maybe social sciences as well. So if you just sort of plug in your discipline's conferences or sort of standard ways of presenting media, the rest of it should ring true. And one last thing, I'm going to be talking about the paper-based conference paper. So there's kind of a growing trend today at conferences for people to give a more freewheeling kind of lecture style conference presentation where they don't read a paper. They might use minimal notes, but they sort of walk around the room and let their slideshow guide them. And that's still in the minority, and it's interesting and it can be very dynamic, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. If you want to go that route, that's great. Talk to your supervisor, talk to your peers. But today I'm going to be talking about the traditional paper-based presentation where you read a sort of 6 to 8 page paper with your slideshow. So having said that, I'm going to open up a PowerPoint slideshow and get going. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so preparing conference papers. So the first question is, should you attend conferences? Should you attend academic conferences, and why? The short answer is yes, you should. I'm aware that this is not always so easy as it seems. Travel and accommodation prices are going up, and the amount of funding dedicated to postgraduate travel expenses is being reduced every year. So attending conferences, even those not terribly far away, can be a financial burden, but it's something you have to try to find a way to do. Save money for a semester, cut down on the pub maybe, or whatever other sort of entertainment you get up to. I know those sorts of things are important outlets, especially during your PhD. Maybe find lower cost outlets for a semester or two. Hit up your department. Sometimes they say they don't have the money, but maybe they have some leftover bursaries from previous years that they still have to spend. Hit up your university. And also, don't be afraid to ask the conference organizers if they have travel bursaries. The small ones often don't, but you can ask them. The larger ones often do, and they happen. I did get $600 for SCMS a few years ago, which was enough to cover my airfare to the US. So don't be afraid to ask for money, because going to conferences eventually is something that you're going to want to do. If you're in the first year or so of your PhD, then presenting at conferences isn't necessarily vital. Although I'd recommend keeping an eye open for conference topics that are specific to your area of research. For example, in the spring of my first year of my PhD, I saw a call for papers for a conference on film archives and authorship, and this was a really vital component of my own research. So even though the conference took place early in my second year and I was really nervous, I went to the conference and presented at it, and it became a kind of foundation for the research I did after that. And I'm still today incredibly grateful that I went to that conference, even though I didn't totally feel ready. But by the end of your second year and into your third year, you should really be considering presenting at 1 or maybe 2 conferences per year. How ambitious you want to be in terms of, for example, sticking to postgraduate conferences, aiming at slightly larger subject-specific conferences, or shooting for one of the large discipline-wide conferences like NEXT or SCMS is something you probably want to discuss with your supervisor. And you want to consider based on, for example, where you are in your research, where the conference is located, so how expensive it's going to be to get there, how comfortable you feel presenting at a conference, and that might vary depending on the size of it or how close or far it is from your specific area of research. Who might accompany you? Are you going with a friend? Are you part of a pre-constituted panel? Is your supervisor going to come? All of those things might help you feel better if you're just getting used to it. And of course, any financial constraints or opportunities that you might have to consider. So you're considering all of this, you're thinking about it. Why do this? There are lots of reasons to attend conferences, professional, social, and otherwise. And for now, I'm only going to be able to talk about 2 really compelling reasons. First is to start getting your research out there and to get feedback on it. You know, and your supervisor likely knows, that you're engaged in groundbreaking work. You're asking questions that haven't been asked. You're probing the discipline and pushing it in new directions. But until you get your work out there, nobody else knows this. Also, the feedback you can get on your work from experts in your field will become invaluable to you. Most conference attendees know that the majority of papers are works in progress, especially if you're early in your career, so they're not going to expect you to have all the answers. They will, however, very likely offer suggestions about approaches you might consider or other sources you might investigate, and those suggestions are frequently incredibly fruitful. The second reason, of course, is to network, and this can also be a hard task for some. I know many academics, myself included, have an introverted nature to some extent, but making connections with other scholars will benefit you down the line. It might not lead directly to a job, but there's a good chance that it could lead to your being invited to join a pre-constituted panel, to guest speak at another university, or maybe to contribute to an edited collection. And these kinds of activities will contribute to your professional development and also burnish your CV when the job hunt does come. Also, despite all the pressure and the nerves and the anxiety that goes into conferences, even for seasoned scholars, they're fun. You get to go to a place where this idea that you've been working on for so long is interesting to, you know, a room, a hall, a hotel full of people, and to talk shop and to really get into it. And it's just invigorating and exciting and something that you should definitely figure out how to start taking part in. So you've decided it's time to start attending conferences. How do you know which ones to go to? And here I'm going to talk a little bit about film and media studies. There are several ways to keep up with new calls for papers, and so I can only touch on a few here. This is something you should talk with your supervisor about as well, get hints from colleagues, ask your PhD cohort, and so on. There are a few online databases that update regularly with CFPs from across a variety of disciplines. The 2 that I most often use are HNet and the UPenn English department. Both of these span the humanities and social sciences, but are searchable within disciplines. However, I also like to just browse the chronological list of entries, because you never know where you might come across a conference in a discipline outside yours that might be very beneficial to attend. So for example, if you go to HNet and you click on HNet services here, you'll get a drop down and it says announcements, and you'll see a page that looks like this. You see call for papers, call for papers, call for publications. Here, the title and subject fields. And one of them on here, if you look more closely, imagining queer, exploring the radical potential of queerness now. And it has all of the typical subjects you think might go with a conference on exploring radical queerness. And down here, visual studies. So you might be doing stuff in queer media or television or things like that, but not think to look outside of film or visual studies. And so if you go through this chronological list without the filter at first, there's a good chance you might come across a conference that you wouldn't have seen before. UPenn is similar. It's a little more old school in its presentation. You can see if you look over here, they even have subject-specific links, so you could go down to film and television or fan studies and so on. And if you clicked on one of those, you'd get here the 50s and pop visual culture, film and television, and so on. When I was doing my PhD and had decided it was time to start attending conferences, I checked these two sites probably about 2 or 3 times a week just to see if anything new was coming up. There was probably also some nervous PhD energy going on in there. By the way, I'll put the links to these in the YouTube video as well. Another good resource is social media. If you're on Facebook, join groups related to your discipline. So here's one called Film Wissenschaft or Film Studies. It's a group based in Germany, but a lot of it's in English. And a lot of what these Facebook groups are used for are CFPs. So if you look on this screenshot from just a couple days ago, you'll see there's 2 CFPs. One's in German, one's in English right here. And you can also see there, that was also posted at HNet. There's also more discipline specific. So I write a little bit about Buffy sometimes. So I joined the Whedon Studies Association Facebook group, which yes, exists. And there are probably similar narrowly tailored groups to your area of study on Facebook. So join those as well. Another thing, join Twitter. A lot of people don't understand Twitter. They don't like Twitter. You don't have to use it actively. You don't have to tweet. You don't ever have to write a tweet in your life. But if you go onto Twitter and start following academics in your area, film studies academics, media studies, screen studies, television studies, whatever it might be, look across to sort of gender, genre, queer studies, and so on. Follow the departments, you know, Maynooth Media Studies or whatever it might be, and CFPs are going to start to scroll past your feed on Twitter, and that's another great resource. Finally, it's going to be a good idea at some point to attend one of the heavy-hitting conferences in your discipline. There are a few of these, but in film and media studies, I'm thinking about SCMS, which is mainly held in North America, NEX in Europe, BAFTAs in the UK, and Screen, which takes place in Glasgow every year. These conferences can be highly competitive, so don't be discouraged if your first submission to one of them is rejected. I think I've been rejected by Screen 5 times and accepted once. I just keep plugging away. It happens to everybody. Being so large, they tend to appreciate pre-constituted panels. So putting one of those together can often significantly increase your chances of acceptance. And also, going as part of a pre-constituted panel provides you with company and moral support at events that can seem overwhelming, especially the first time you attend them. But even still, where they are overwhelming, these large conferences can be fabulous places to really expand your thinking, not only about your topic, but your broader discipline, and also to catch up on other areas of research. Yeah, just one second. Got my notes out of order here, apologies. That interest you, and of course, to network. NEX in particular has been very good to me. It happens in the summer. It's in a different European city. Everybody's finished teaching and marking. So there's a really relaxed vibe that makes it really enjoyable. But any case, all of these conferences tend to have their CFP due dates around the same time every year. So SCMS is late summer, Screen and Next are sometime in January, and so on. So keep an eye on their sites. Their CFPs will come out. Think about people you might want to get on a panel with and go. Once you've been accepted to the conference, now it's time to start thinking about writing your paper. Perhaps you think you've already written a lot of it. It's a chapter or a section of your dissertation. But just please remember that an audience listening to a paper is very different from an audience reading a paper. So even if you think you have a paper ready, it's really important to retool it for a conference presentation. So for the next few minutes, I'd just like to offer a few pointers for how to craft a strong conference paper, one that will best display the important work you're doing and clearly convey it to a listening audience. Again, this isn't paper writing 101. These are just some ideas about how to get your point across. So this leads me to my first point, which is consider your audience. A listening audience is very different from a reading one, as I've said, in terms of how they follow along, how much information they retain, and you need to keep that in mind. In fact, audience consideration will inform most of the tips that I offer in this section. In particular are two things that you should try to appreciate. First is the composition of your audience. Depending on the conference, you might have a potential audience that's well-informed in much of your paper's subject area, if you're at a specialized conference, for example. Whereas at a more open general conference, there's a good chance you'll have audience members who know little about your topic. And you need to be able to get them up to speed quickly without taking too much time away from your paper's central point. So I was at a paper at SCMS this spring that was on Deleuze's use of the time image, or the use of Deleuze's time image in a particular film. And I didn't know very much about Deleuze or the time image. And the speaker probably knew that because this was a big general conference and her panel wasn't a philosophy panel or a Deleuze panel. So she took a couple of minutes to kind of explain what she meant by the time image and how she was going to use it. Whereas at a film philosophy conference or at a Deleuze conference, she probably wouldn't have needed to include as much of that explanatory material. So you have to think about who your audience is. Say a bit more about context in a few minutes and give some more examples of what I mean. So second, and this goes more to structure than content, is that you need to be aware that listening audiences receive and process information differently from reading audiences. They don't have the opportunity to go back over sentences or paragraphs. You, great writer that you are, may compose beautiful, intricate, perfectly structured long sentences that look fantastic on the page. But first of all, such sentences can be really difficult to read aloud, especially when you're nervous. And secondly, they can present a strain on listeners. Remember that an audience wants to follow you. They want to keep up with your observations and arguments and go along with you on the journey of this paper. Make it easier for them with clear, concise sentences that make a point. This isn't to say that you can't discuss complex or nuanced issues. Do so, definitely do so. But if you do so with clarity and concision, your audience will not only be more likely to take in the points you're making, but they'll also be more appreciative, and that's important. It's much nicer for you, in fact, even calming, to look up from your paper and see audience members smiling and nodding their heads than to see them staring off into space, checking their phone, or even nodding off. So keeping your audience in mind, it's a good idea, and some people will tell you something different from this, so this is just my pointer, but it's a good idea to structure your paper around one central idea or concept. In support of that idea, you'll need introductory material and some context, which might include a theoretical framework, historical context, data sets, production background, and so on. If you're in screen studies, there's also a likelihood that you'll have a clip or some other media component. Together, all this material can take up 10 minutes or more of your paper. This means you're getting close to having only half of your paper length to discuss your central point. Even less if you need to spend substantial time outlining detailed theoretical constructs that inform your central idea. Depending on the type of paper you're delivering, your central idea might be film analysis, theoretical observation, an act of historiography, or something else. But if it's well contextualized and well articulated, you'll really only have time for that one idea. And you should state it clearly in your introduction. And make sure you can be clear throughout how each point you raise supports or at least relates to that central idea. For example, and I'll give a few examples from this one paper I gave. It was when I was a postgraduate. It was about 8 or 9 years ago, and it was a paper on the use of transdiegetic music in the films of the director Hal Ashby. So I was at this conference, and it was a big topic for me, and my paper could have got bogged down trying to catalog all the different ways Ashby uses this kind of music, or what each iteration of it means in the different films. But I chose to stick to its use in one scene in one film, Coming Home, and to discuss only how its appearance in that film works to disorientate viewers' sense of time in geographic space. At the time, I had a sense that I was one of the few film researchers working on transdiegetic music, so my brain was exploding with ideas. I wanted to talk about transdiegetic music all the time, ask my friends. And many of those ideas went into my thesis in the end, of course. But I had to work really hard on that paper to limit myself to discussing only these points I've mentioned. The result of this kind of approach is that an audience gets a strong sense of your work and some of your strengths as a researcher. Also, by not covering every possible aspect of a topic, you leave room for engagement with the audience during the Q&A. Now, one of the areas of the paper that I mentioned might take time away from your main discussion is setting a context for your central argument or idea. As I've mentioned, how much time you spend on this will depend somewhat on your audience and how knowledgeable you think they might be on your topic. But however long your contextualization is, it's a necessary component of your paper because it places your work in the ongoing discourse around your topic. And it's important to show your audience not only that you're aware of the state of the research on your topic, but also how your work is developing or interrogating or in some other way rethinking that existing discourse. This section will generally come after your introduction and can require a couple pages, although I wouldn't recommend going much longer than that. What do you need to contextualize? Well, that's very dependent on your topic, and different people will give you different opinions and advice about this. So ask others, discuss it with your supervisor. But here are a few tips that I would give. First, try to minimize too much factual information. Dates, filmographies, production personnel, etc. All of this information can be incredibly helpful, and I don't mean to say avoid it completely, but consider what's absolutely necessary and stick to that. For example, in the Ashby paper I mentioned, I was aware at the time that most film people still weren't really knowledgeable about Ashby, and because I'd been working on him for a couple years at that point, I had the temptation to explain everything about him. I had to resist that. And all I did was put up one slide with a partial filmography. And I hoped that by seeing Harold and Maude or being there up there, that would be enough to sort of trigger the audience's ideas about the kind of filmmaker I was working with. The same would be true, for example, if you were working with production details like budgets or location shooting, reception details about box office or critical reviews, other historical details, and so on. All of this context will be really interesting and even important in your larger project. But if it's not somehow directly relevant to the topic of your conference paper, you can probably leave it out. However, it's a good idea to bring those details with you in your notes. Type them up and put them on a page at the end of your paper. That way, if they do come up, you can be sure to answer those questions in the Q&A. You might think you have all the budget figures of the film you're talking about, but you're up there, you're nervous, and your mind goes blank. So all the details you cut from your paper, bring them with you anyway, and you'll be glad that you did. A bit trickier is the theoretical context. And this is where you must show that you're familiar with the current state of your field and aware of your contributions to it. If your paper is more theoretical in nature, this might also be where you start to build the structure on which your argument rests. There can be a temptation here to list and quote every relevant scholar working in your field. You might feel pressure to cover all your bases. Not only can this considerably lengthen your paper before you even get to your own ideas, but I hate to say it, this can also be the spot where you start to lose your audience as you mention and then quote one scholar after another. It can take on the feel of a miniature literature review. And my advice, and this is just my advice, and I'm sure other people will disagree on this point specifically, but my advice would be to pick the one or two key theorists whose work is central to the specific point your paper is making. Give them a bit of space in your paper. Then for the others, a mention. That should be enough to inspire confidence in your audience, and it also creates more Q&A material. So in my paper on Ashby, I wanted to mention every sound and music theorist who'd written about anything closely resembling transdiegetic music, from Shion to Gorman to Stilwell, etc. But I didn't. In the end, I only mentioned one. I put up a small slide with one concise definition of transdiegetic music, and then I mentioned in one sentence that the others, like Shion and Gorman and so on, had written about it as well. And then if they wanted to ask me about Shion's take or Gorman's take, I could talk about it in the Q&A. This allowed me more time in my paper to concentrate on my own interpretations. And this leads me to the next component of your paper. You must find a way to include some form of theorization or interpretation in your paper. It won't be enough that you've noticed or discovered something new in a film or a new filmmaker. You've got to ground your discoveries and observations within a construct that makes sense of them. The cool archival documents you found or the wonderful underappreciated director that you're working on will definitely excite your listeners, for sure. Film people, screen people, media people, we all want to hear this new stuff, no doubt. But what will really leave an impression on them is when they see how you framed those discoveries or rediscoveries within the historical or production or theoretical context that you've constructed. In other words, present your findings, but also theorize them so that your audience can appreciate how you are able to enrich and complicate your own observations, but also how you can enrich or complicate the area you're working in. Okay, and I was going to say something here about the paper I was working on as well, but I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit. The important thing here, though, is that this theorization of your ideas is a necessary step, and it should probably come right after the observations and the analysis you perform. In a few minutes, I'll put up a slide with a very rough outline of a paper order. Before moving on to talk a bit about visual presentations, I'd just like to quickly touch on a few more minor details that you probably know, but people tend to forget, and they're actually quite major in the end, the kind of things that will really help your paper work better. So, oh no, I did put up the loose structure here. So I'll just go through this really quickly. Got my slides around. So these are the things I just talked about. These are rough guidelines. It depends how long your paper is. It depends, again, like if your context is 2 pages, you might have to cut 1 page off your observation and analysis. And I'll come back to talking about timing again in just a couple of moments. But here, let's move on to these other key elements. Okay, first, use clear transitions in your paper. Remember that your audience can't see it. They can't tell when one paragraph ends and the next begins. They can't see section titles. So you have to make them aware of these things. And the key to that is solid transitions. Every time you introduce a new topic or section, additional information, a counter argument, or your conclusion, convey these moves to your audience. Like I said before, the audience wants to follow you along the journey of this paper. Transitions are the signposts that tell them where you're heading next. And everybody knows this, but it's surprising how many conference papers you hear that just jump from one thing to the next. And that can be very confusing for an audience. It's not that hard to put in another word that says, however, or in addition, or furthermore, or and also but, whatever it is. And I do like to mix formal and informal. This is up to you and your style. There should be formal, I say like 60-ish%, because you are in a formal academic setting, but it's also not a journal article. You are talking to your peers. So use howevers, but also don't be afraid to use buts. It's also important to have a clear and obvious conclusion. You'd be surprised how many conference papers you'll see where they go through their analysis, they go through their theorization, and then they go, oh, and that's it. Use a transition and announce it as your conclusion. Tie up the strands of your paper. If your paper's a work of progress and you haven't quite formulated your conclusion yet, that's okay. But just say so. If you say something like, for example, to conclude, I'd just like to reiterate that this is a work in progress and I haven't quite determined what it all adds up to. Next, I plan to investigate X theory in relation to the problem. Or maybe, next I plan to visit Z archive in search of primary material. Then you can add a type of a kind of tying up statement along the lines of, but it seems to me that pursuing this line of inquiry will enhance or complicate or reinscribe, or whatever verb you want to use there, our understanding of this director or film or era or media project. Thank you. This invites questions, this invites comments, this invites advice, and it also invites further talk outside for coffee and so on. And that way you've been clear with the audience both about where you are in your research and also your receptiveness to this advice. And finally, one last word of advice. Please, 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 please stick to the time. An audience can feel it when a paper's about to run over. If you have a 20-minute slot and your paper hits sort of 18 minutes and there's not a sign that you're wrapping up soon, tension in the room actually increases. People start to shift in their seats and, oh no, here we go. Running over time is just bad form, and the audience knows this. It takes time away from your co-panelists. It takes time away from the Q&A. It puts pressure on your chair to shut you down, and no chair wants to have to do that. And it weighs on your audience, not just because they get tense knowing you're breaking the rules, but because 20 minutes actually is a pretty ideal amount of time to absorb one speaker talking about their idea. Everybody's different. We read and speak at different speeds, especially if we're nervous. Some of us are good at sticking to the text, while others are prone to offering up little jokes or asides that take up time. In my experience, if you have roughly 2 minutes of media, a clip or 2 or 3 short clips or whatever it might be, then you're looking at roughly 7 double-spaced pages, just about 2,000 words. Again, you might speak faster or slower and have more or less than that. If your media is longer, that will affect it as well. If you're unsure, aim for about 18 minutes and definitely practice. Practice on your own, practice in front of a mirror, even if you feel silly. If you can, practice in front of a friend so you can get a feel for how you might deliver the paper to an audience. But please, whatever you do, keep to the time, even if it means you have to cut sections out. Your audience will thank you, and a thankful, happy audience will be a much more receptive audience. Now, I'd like to move on and say just a few words about visual presentations. First of all, if you are in any area of screen or media studies, I would say you have to have some sort of visual presentation. Audiences have come to expect it, and there will be some in the audience who are disappointed if you don't have one. If your paper's on a topic that doesn't lend itself to the visual, put something on the screen, even if it's just a single slide with a still image and your name and email address. Ideally, though, a more interactive slideshow can help direct your audience's attention while also expanding on some of the points of information in your text. but you have to be careful how you use your presentation software, whether it's PowerPoint or whatever else it might be, because a bad PowerPoint can be almost just as bad as none at all. So I'm going to give you just a few tips, and I'm going to kind of run through these quickly, actually, because we're running out of time. My phone's ringing in the background. Apologies for that. So here are some tips for visual presentations. Keep the number of words on a slide to a minimum. Nobody wants to read large blocks of text like some of these slides I have here, long sentences or entire quotations. They want to listen to you. They're there to hear what you have to say, and what's on screen should enhance what you're saying. If you force your audience to read huge blocks of text, you're actually asking them to stop listening to you for a minute or 2 minutes, and that's not what you want. Use images. Ideally, you'll have at least one image per slide. Stills from a film, pictures of a director or theorist, a graph, keep them simple, or chart. Let your image take up half the slide if you can. It'll be visually dynamic, and it will give you less space for text. Use a large font size. If you're putting text on a slide, you want the audience to be able to read it. Online, I've seen a lot of sites that recommend 24 point. Obviously, it depends on the type of font you're using. Font sizes vary, but go for 30 as a minimum if you can. That's what I would say. Use bullet points. I hate bullet points in my writing, but I love to use them in presentations for a couple of reasons. They compartmentalize information, but they also make it so that you don't have to use sentences, which helps you to cut down on your word count. And finally, and I say this one with one caveat, avoid putting up chunks of texts that you then read. If you're reading it from the paper, the audience doesn't need to see it as well. My one exception to this is sometimes when I have a long quotation, I'll put it on the slide and also read it, but only when I want to return to that quotation at some point before I move on to the next slide. So I don't have to reread the whole thing again. I can just point up to it, and there it is on the screen. But generally, don't read what's on the screen. And another thing is how to handle your video clips if you're using them. And there's a lot of fuss about this. Do you embed them in PowerPoint? Do you not embed them in PowerPoint or whatever software you're using? Do you have them all open at once? That is something that can be done. Do a Google search, how to open 3 VLC windows at once. You can do it. You can do it with QuickTime and so on, or embed them. Whatever works best for you. The point is that you're not up there wrestling with your clips, taking up valuable time by moving it to the starting place because you didn't think to do that, or fiddling with a wonky DVD player that ejected your disc mid-presentation, or whatever it might be. So here's just a couple of tips for video clips in whatever way you want to use them, embedded or not. Have them set to the proper starting place. There's nothing worse than when I'm watching a paper with 3 or 4 or 5 clips, and every single one, the presenter's like, oh, hold on, I have to move it. Oh, just a second. Oh, that's not quite it. Hold on, please. It takes a couple of minutes to do that before your presentation, and they're ready to go. Make sure you can easily stop, start, fast forward, rewind, in case you do want to move around in the clip after you've shown it. Can you do that on the computer you're using, especially if you're not using your own? Simple one, but check it during setup. Can you easily raise or lower the volume? And also, I already kind of alluded to this, is it easy to maneuver between your clips and your slideshow, right? You don't want that to take up a production. And also, you start to feel silly. You start to feel like your teachers felt back when you were in school and they didn't know how to work the VCR. One last word of advice. If I were you, I would avoid DVDs and YouTube. DVDs are great. They probably look better, but every institution's DVD player setup is different. I've seen DVDs get ejected. I've seen them go to the home screen. I've seen them freeze. These are all things that you just don't want to deal with. There's a great piece of software called Handbrake. There's the links in the YouTube description below. It's free, and you can take a clip from anywhere in a DVD from second to second, so you can get it exactly how you want it. I'd also avoid YouTube clips. YouTube's another one. You get the clip set up perfectly, and then you go to use it in your presentation, and YouTube has frozen, or it has reset to the beginning of the clip, or the Wi-Fi in the lecture hall has conked out, or whatever it might be. Do a Google search, YouTube to MPEG. There are tons of free websites that will turn your YouTube video into a downloadable file in a matter of seconds, depending on the speed of your connection. So have your clips as clips and make sure you can maneuver between them quickly and efficiently. One last thing about clips, and again, different people will differ on this, but it's a good idea to give your clip an introduction. What part of the film are you watching and why? And I find it's a good idea to write this introduction into your actual paper. It can sound a little bit robotic, and you think that you know your film, so you don't need to write that down. But people get nervous, and it's another thing where you get up in front of them and you're about to introduce this great clip and you forgot the main character's name or something like that, and you just can't recall it. Write it down, and then even if you want to go off the cuff during the presentation, if you have one of those mind-melting moments, you can look down in your paper and all the information is there. Okay, as I said at the beginning, I had a little section here on difficult questions that I'm going to skip over, but I'm going to put the slides up quickly while I talk so that people who watch this on YouTube later can just have an idea of what I'm talking about. So there's the question that's actually a good question, but you can't answer it. There's the long, complicated, show-offy question. My friend Ginny calls this peacocking. And then there's the worst, is the aggressive question. These are very rare, and you don't have to worry about them, but they do happen. So it's good to be prepared. Your chair should help you here. But be prepared for these kinds of questions. In the end, the point is, don't fake it. If you can't answer the question, don't answer it. And at the very least, no matter how aggressive the person is, thank them for their point. Write a little note, even if you're writing, God, I can't believe this jerk. So it looks like you're taking what they've said to heart, and then move on. And like I said, your chair should help you with that. We won't have much time for Q&A, but if anyone wants to ask questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it. So just to wrap up then, conferences can be a great experience. You'll get to meet and know new colleagues, get caught up on elements of your discipline, and get to give your own work a good test run. There's a good chance you'll come away with fresh ideas, new ways of thinking about your research, and at least one or two contacts that you might stay in touch with for a long time, throughout your career maybe even. Plus, you'll gain valuable experience in public speaking and networking, both of which are vital to your career, including if you leave academia. Public speaking and networking are vital to every career these days. And just a reminder, your paper presentation is part of a dialogue. It's a dialogue with the scholars who have come before you and others who are working in your field now. But it's also a dialogue with your audience. Your paper is the opening gambit in a long conversation that will be continued in the Q&A, but hopefully beyond the Q&A as well. Keep your audience in mind. Give them a clear idea to work with, ground it in a context that makes sense, direct them clearly from point to point with verve and inspiration, and illustrate it all with a concise, compelling visual presentation. Your audience will want to continue that dialogue with you after the conference is over. Thank you. Okay. That's the end of the PowerPoint. And I'm going to come back over here and see if anyone's still around. And, oh, hi, Cormac.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good.
It ran a little late because I had some technical difficulties and didn't get started until about 20 past, I think. So.
The irony.
Yeah, exactly. I found out if you hit the stop broadcast button, it completely ends the presentation, so I had to go in and start up a whole new presentation.
Okay. So there is, I don't know, Akira seems to be here. Is she actually there? I'll unmute her. Maybe
She's
not.
not muted, I don't believe.
Well, she seems to be muted from my point of view.
I'm here, but my connection's really bad.
Oh, hi, I hear you
Hello?
now. How are you?
Hi.
So I might disappear again in a minute.
Okay, I was wondering why you were coming and going.
I'm just typing up and stuff. So
thanks for that, Erin. I only caught the last 10 minutes. I was, or yeah, maybe a bit more. I was on another call and I just could not cancel the other call, I'm afraid.
It's all right.
But yeah, it was interesting. It's funny. It's a lot of the things you were saying. I kind of know them, but just having somebody spell it out is actually very useful. Just don't go over time. Like, it's so obvious, but people do it all the time.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible thing to do. And the slides thing, I mean, this is something I do with my own students. When they, first of all, with my own students, I like, just in class or seminar work, I often forbid PowerPoint because it's or its equivalents, because it kind of provides an unnecessary crutch where people just put stuff up on the screen so that you don't look at them, and because they feel they must put something there. And I think I differ with you a bit. I think sometimes no PowerPoint is better than a bad one. Or no, sorry, no PowerPoint is better than a sort of pointless one. Personally, I would rather have 0 on the screen than the person's name and email or whatever. I just kind of think, if there's nothing to put up, there's nothing to put up. But maybe.
Yeah, I've seen good conference papers that didn't have any sort of presentation. I do think, though, especially in sort of kind of screen and media studies, that, I mean, I've been in rooms where the person gets up and maybe their paper turns out to be great, but it becomes clear, oh, there's no slideshow, and there's a sort of a heave in the audience of like, oh man. And it's not, it doesn't say anything about the person's paper, but I think it's that sort of audience expectation that we're in film studies, we want to see media. And that might not be a good expectation, but I kind of think it's there. So in that sense, just giving something for the eyes to look at, especially when these days everybody has their phone or their tablet or whatever it is, and they'll look away when there's no kind of eye candy at all. But I know what you mean. I think that putting stuff up just to put up is also not always great. I had the idea of including this tip. I've seen a few good slideshows where somebody just has, let's say, 10 clips from the 10, not clips rather, but stills from the film that they're talking about, or 10, relevant images, and they just put it on an automatic slideshow, and every 2 minutes the image sort of changes. So it's relevant and it's helping to keep the audience's attention.
Yeah.
In a way that doesn't distract from the talk, but it also doesn't look like, hey, look at this, I did this just because I had to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I noticed, I gave a paper at SCMS in Toronto where we just were a couple of weeks ago, and without any visual content at all, it was just a lecture, a paper. And about a year before, I gave roughly the same paper, although I shouldn't say that, but I did at film philosophy. And at film philosophy, it's maybe partly to do with the dynamics of the room, but it was a smaller room. It was more seminar sort of atmosphere. And so me sitting there and sort of speaking to people in a kind of a much more kind of across the table kind of way didn't present any problem at all that there was no visual content. Whereas when I was at SCMS and it was a different room and definitely a different kind of audience, I think they were, on the whole, not very pleased with the fact that there was no visual content.
Right.
So I suppose it depends on your audience, and you have to anticipate that. Like, the film philosophy people are as interested in philosophy as film, and so they will sit and listen to you talking about Heidegger for 20 minutes if that's what it is.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the most important point that I want to try to convey, is that I mean, it's always hard. You never know. You show up at one conference and there's 20 people there and you're like, oh my God, why are there 20 people here? And you show up at another conference and there's 2. So you can't always anticipate your audience, but you can look at the conference that you're going to and kind of guess what kind of audience might be there and sort of tailor your not just your paper, but your overall presentation to what you're anticipating. And I think it's something like SCMS where there's a good chance that, you know, half the room or more is completely unfamiliar with the intricacies of your topic. Then having something for them to sort of look at and attach onto is probably helpful or useful.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite, I think you're right. Yeah, yeah. I don't think I'd do it again if I went to SCMS again. I'm just trying to recall what else you were talking about there. The idea of writing something down as somebody's asking you a question, even if they're aggressive, is quite good. I like that. Yeah.
I kind of feel like I've only had sort of 2 aggressive questions in the last 10 years or so. And I feel like, I know some people will want to rise to that, and if that's your temperament or personality, okay. But I feel like one of the ways to diffuse those situations is just to sort of show that you're listening, even if you're kind of faking it, you know, because sometimes people, for whatever reason, just feel like they want to be heard. And if you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this person. What they see is, oh, he's taken my comments to heart.
Yeah. And
that can help diffuse it. But maybe you want to, you know, get into it down and out with them. I don't know. I've seen that too. The worst, and I didn't have time to address this, is the aggressive person who won't listen to your answer and continues to restate their kind of aggressive pointed question over and over, especially when the chair, for whatever reason, is not quite able to contain or control that person. So not only do they put you on the spot, they end up dominating that whole session. And there should be like a buzzer that drops those people into a tank of water. Anyway.
Yeah. There's a note from Kira. I'm sorry, I keep dropping out. Okay, she'll watch it later. Yeah, I'm going to go back and watch the whole thing from the start. I think this automatically goes onto the Irish Screen Studies YouTube channel.
I think it does, and I think my other aborted effort that was 30 seconds long is up there too. So I'll go and delete that one.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to say, just for anybody who watches this later, thank you for taking part in any of these Irish Screen Studies webinars. This is the end of the 2018 season, but we're planning to do it again next autumn. And also, if any screen media scholars in Ireland or elsewhere see this and like the idea and want to take part in it, including postgraduate or early career people, just get in touch with us over the summer. We're at irishscreenstudies@gmail.com, and we're happy to start incorporating other voices into this webinar series. So we'd like to hear other people's ideas for webinars and get other people involved.
Great. Yeah, I agree. Hear, hear. Okay, all right, I've got to run. I've got a pickup to make.
Okay.
So thank you, Aaron. Sorry I didn't hear the whole thing, but I'll go back to the beginning and I'll hear what I missed. I'll see what I missed.
Okay.
But what I saw was really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Kira. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon, Kira.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.